The Wrong Number by R.L. Stine. Read by GoatDad7813. Prologue. Scheming. It was the thing he'd been best at in his life. Seeing something he wanted and figuring out how to go after it step by step. Sure, he'd messed up a lot. He'd had some bad luck. Some people got in his way, ruined his perfect plans. That wouldn't happen this time. This plan was his best. No way it could fail. No way he'd let anyone mess up this one. As he sat in the dark, rolling it over and over in his mind, a sneer formed on his face. It was too bad what he had to do. He really didn't want to hurt anyone. But what choice did he have? He had to take care of himself. No one else was going to take care of him. He'd learned that early, beginning with his parents. Now he knew it was time to act, and not think about what had happened to him in the past. After all, it wasn't his fault that he was always getting in trouble. That was going to change. From now on, things would go exactly the way he wanted them to. He'd made the perfect plan. On the surface, everything seemed normal. But someone was due for a big surprise. A deadly surprise. All he had to do was be patient. Be patient and wait until it was time to act. Chapter 1. The first week in September. The blob of green gel oozed like something from the bottom of a decaying swamp. It spread and settled in its container, quivering as if searching for a way to escape or a way to take over. Dina Martinson plunged her hand into the porcelain sink and slowly squeezed in the gelatinous mass. "Yuck," she said. "Are you sure you want me to put this on your hair?" "Go ahead," said her friend Jade Smith. Jade was sitting on a wooden stool in front of the bathroom mirror, a towel covering her shoulders. Her freshly washed auburn hair hanging in damp coils down her back. "I know your mom's a professional hairdresser," said Dina, "but this stuff looks like the thing that ate Cincinnati, and I won't even tell you what it feels like." "Go on," Jade insisted. "My mom uses it on her hair all the time, and it looks great, all shiny and full of body." "Are you sure you don't mean dead bodies?" cracked Dana. She began applying the gel to her friend's hair. Soon the long tresses were covered with slime and gave off a faintly jello-y scent. "Now what?" she asked when she had finished. "Now we wait for it to dry," said Dina, "at which point I'll be ravishing. Sure you don't want to try it? We could do your hair in spikes." Dina fingered her own baby-fine hair. It was shortish and blondish and straightish. All she could do was wear it layered and hope for the best. Her mother said her hairdo made her look like an angel. She wasn't sure she liked that idea, but spikes didn't sound any better. "No thanks," she said. "I have enough problems without trying secret Formula XO9 or whatever it is." "It could be your big chance," said Jade, but she didn't push it. She didn't seem to care much. In fact, she sounded a little bored, as bored as Dina felt. "What a way to spend a Saturday night," said Dina with a sigh. "Yeah, I hate to admit it," said Jade, "but I'll actually be glad when school starts Monday. It'll be great to see all the kids, start going to dances and games." "Yeah, I guess," said Dina. "Hey, Miss Enthusiasm." "It's just I don't know what to expect," Dina said. "Things are going to be different." "What do you mean?" "I just found out that my brother Chuck is going to be living here." "Your brother?" "You don't have a brother," said Jade. "My half-brother, actually. He's my dad's son from his first marriage. I've only met him a few times. He's coming to Shadyside for his senior year." "Really?" Jade was all ears now. But then she usually was when boys were concerned. "Down, girl," said Dina. "Chuck is nothing but trouble. In fact, that's why he's coming here. He was supposed to graduate from Central City last year, but he got expelled. His mom and my dad decided he'd do better in a small town like Shadyside. Expelled? Said Jade. What for? I'm not sure, said Dina. It had something to do with some kids he hung out with. He actually got arrested one time. He's been getting in trouble ever since he was little. He sounds interesting, said Jade with a mischievous smile. To you, Freddy Krueger would sound interesting, cracked Dina, wandering into her bedroom. It's just that the regular boys at Shadyside are so predictable, said Jade, following her. That's predictable, spelled B-O-R-I-N-G. She pulled the towel off her shoulders, then shook her damp hair out and pirouetted in front of the full-length mirror on Dina's closet door, admiring her figure. She was wearing a pink and white checked jumpsuit with short sleeves. Dina heard that redheads weren't supposed to wear pink, but Jade looked good in every color of the rainbow, and she knew it. In fact, she was very vain. But Dina had to admit, Jade had a lot to be vain about. How's your hair doing? Dina asked to change the subject. Still cooking, said Jade. She suppressed a yawn, then sat on Dina's bed and began using an emery board on her already perfect nails. She looked around the room, her eyes stopping on a bright blue plastic object on the bedside table. What's this? She said. My new phone, said Dina. When my dad got promoted to vice president of the phone company, they gave us the latest instruments. It's pretty rad, said Jade, picking it up. It looks like the control panel for a jet plane or something. What are all these buttons for? They're for programming in phone numbers, said Dina. You push one button and the phone automatically dials a number. That button's for putting the caller on hold, and this switch, she pointed to a switch on the handset, turns it into a speakerphone, so everyone in the room can hear the conversation. Yeah? Said Jade. That sounds like it has possibilities. In fact, it gives me an idea. Whose numbers are in it? I haven't programmed in too many yet, said Dina. Just my grandmother, Mrs. Weller next door, and you, of course. Me? Really? How do I dial it? Just punch number 3. Watch this. My little sister Kathy's babysitting the kids tonight. She punched number 3, then flipped the switch for the speaker, a strange smile on her face. Hello, she said, holding her nose so she sounded as if she had a cold. Miss Kathy Smith, please. This is Kathy Smith, said a voice on the other end. Through the speaker, her voice sounded hollow and far away, as if it were coming from the bottom of a well. I'm calling from the Division Street Mall Association, said Jade, still holding her nose. Miss Smith, I regret to inform you that you have been selected Worst Dressed Shopper of the Month. What? Shrieked Kathy at the other end. I didn't even go to the mall today. You were positively identified by over a dozen shoppers, said Jade. You have exactly 1 hour to pick up your prize, a dozen wilted daisies. A dozen what? Wailed Kathy. Then her voice turned suspicious. Wait a minute. I know who this is. It's not the mall. Jade, I know you... I don't know what you're talking about, said Jade, pinching her nose even tighter. This is the... You can't fool me, Kathy went on. Next time, pick on someone as stupid as you are. The sound of the click as she hung up filled the room. Rats, said Jade. I should try it with someone who doesn't know my voice so well. Someone who would never suspect. I've got it. Dina, Look up Henry Raven's phone number." "Henry Raven?" said Dina. "He's such a nerd. All he cares about is his computer. Why do you want to talk to him?" "Just watch," said Jade. "Or rather, listen to this." She took the phone book from Dina and punched in 7 digits. The sound of a ringing phone filled the room, then a click, and then the unmistakable voice of Henry Raven. "Hello?" "Hello. Is this Henry?" Jade was talking so low she was almost whispering, and Dina thought her voice sounded mysterious and sexy. "This is Henry," said Henry. "Who is this?" "You don't know me, Henry," whispered Jade, "but I've had my eye on you for a long time." She whispered long so that it sounded like long. Her voice was breathy and seductive. "Who is this?" "Someone who'd like to be a good friend. I like your style, Henry." "Is this some kind of a joke?" "It's no joke," said Jade. "I've never been more serious. You're just the kind of guy a girl like me yearns for." There was a long silence at the other end. Then suddenly Henry sputtered, "Find another guy. I don't have time for this." And he hung up the phone with a bang. Both girls fell over on the bed laughing hysterically. "Did you hear that? He doesn't have time." Dina couldn't stop giggling. "That was even better than I expected," said Jade when she stopped laughing. "Now it's your turn." "My turn," said Dina. "Sure, you heard me. We'll just pick—" "Jade, no," said Dina. "I can't even talk to people in person." "That's the whole point," said Jade. "It's much easier when you're anonymous. Now let's see." She went on flipping through Dina's phone book. "How about Rob Morrell?" "Rob Morrell?" shrieked Dina. "He's one of the most popular boys in the whole school." "So what?" said Jade. "You like him, don't you?" "Sure," said Dina. "But when he was in my geometry class last year, I could never think of anything to say to him." "Well, now's your chance," said Jade. "But what if he finds out it's me?" "Just whisper like I did, and he won't even have a clue," said Jade, ignoring Dina's continuing protests. She punched in the number and thrust the phone at her friend. "But what'll I say?" cried Dina, looking horrified. "Whatever comes to your mind," said Jade. "Just be sexy." "Hello?" squeaked Dina. Then she took a deep breath and dropped her voice. "May I speak to Rob Morrell, please?" "Great." Jade mouthed the word. After a moment, a sleepy-sounding boy's voice came over the speaker. "Hello?" "Hello, Rob," whispered Dina, making her voice as seductive as possible. "What's a good-looking guy like you doing home on a Saturday night?" "I rented some movies," Rob said. "Who is this?" "This is your secret admirer," said Dina. The words just came to her. "My what? What's your name?" "I can't tell you my name, because then it wouldn't be secret anymore." Dina was amazed at herself. So far the words came easily, as if she were reading some of them from a script. "Well, if you can't tell me your name, tell me what you look like," said Rob. He no longer sounded sleepy. In fact, he was sounding interested. Dina shut her eyes and leaned back on the bed. "What do I look like?" she repeated. "Well, I'm about 5'4", 105 pounds, with blonde hair to my waist, and my eyes are green, and I have full lips. People tell me I look like Kim Basinger." "Say, maybe we could get together sometime," said Rob. "I like that," said Dina. "You're such a good-looking guy. I'll call you again one night real soon." "Well, how about tonight?" said Rob. Or tomorrow? Can I have your number?" "I've got to go now," said Dina. "Remember, I'll call again." She leaned forward and hung up the phone and looked at Jade a moment. They collapsed back on the bed, shrieking with laughter. "He bought it," said Dina. "I can't believe it. He was practically drooling." "You were great," said Jade. "You're a natural. He'll probably stay home waiting by the phone for the next month." "You were right," said Dina. "It was easy, much easier than talking to someone in person." "I told you so," said Jade. "So who should we call next? How about—" "Not tonight," said Dina, looking at her watch. "It's getting late, and my folks'll be home any minute." "What about tomorrow?" said Jade. Dina shook her head. "Tomorrow night my dad and I are driving to the airport to pick up my brother, Chuck." "Be sure to tell him hello for me," said Jade. "He doesn't even know you." Jade turned her full smile on. "Not now he doesn't," she said. "But I have a feeling he will soon." Chapter 2. On the way to the airport, Dina felt both excited and nervous. She was beginning to like the idea of having a long-lost brother in the house. In fact, she realized there could be certain important advantages, such as he could introduce her to his friends. Then she'd remember everything she'd heard about the trouble Chuck had been in. She got a funny feeling in the pit of her stomach that maybe things weren't going to work out so well. Also, her father seemed really nervous, even more nervous than she was. "Be friendly to him, Dina," her dad said, "but try to give him space. Remember, he grew up in a big city and isn't used to small-town friendliness." "Right," said Dina. "He'll probably think we're all a bunch of hicks," she thought. Her first glimpse of Chuck was promising. She hadn't seen him since he was about 10, and he'd grown up since then. He was tall now, and his t-shirt and tight jeans showed off the top muscles of an athlete. His hair was thick and sandy above startlingly blue eyes. Jade, Dina knew, would call Chuck a hunk. But when she got closer, she knew that something was wrong with the picture of the all-American good-looking guy. For one thing, there was the expression on his face. Dina wasn't sure what it was. It seemed to be somehow between a scowl and a sneer. A snowl? She wondered. Then Dina's father put out his hand for a handshake. Chuck pretended he didn't see it. Mr. Martinson looked a little flustered and smiled uncertainly. "Chuck, you remember your sister Dina?" Chuck looked at her as if she were a toad or some other low form of life. "Hello, kid," he said. Kid? This year was going to be awful, Dina knew. But in the next instant, Chuck smiled at her, a goofy, lopsided smile that made him look like a completely different person. She smiled back nervously, wondering what to expect next. On the way home, it was even more confusing. Dina sat in the back seat and listened while her father and Chuck talked. Except it was mostly her father talking. Chuck just grunted. Once he said, "This is such a drag, man. I don't see why I can't go back to Central City High." "Because they won't let you back in," said Mr. Martinson. "Your mother and I have repeatedly talked to them, as you well know." For the first time, Dina's father sounded a little exasperated, maybe even angry. Dina hoped to hear more about why Chuck had been expelled. "I want to make it clear to you," her father started, but the sound of squealing brakes and screeching tires interrupted him. Dina screamed at the sound of the crash. She heard glass shattering and another crash. A horn started honking, then another. Someone cried out. More tires squealed. Dina held her hands over her ears. Mr. Martinson, a look of horror on his face, His mouth wide open stomped on the brakes. His tan BMW skidded towards a jumble of other cars and came to a stop just inches from the car in front of it. Behind them, Dina could hear more cars sliding and skidding. "Get out!" Mr. Martinson ordered. "It'll be safer outside the car." Dina and Chuck quickly scrambled out onto the grassy shoulder and away from the pile of cars. Up above, 1,000,000 stars were sparkling in the sky. Chuck began to trot toward the crowd at the front of the traffic jam. Dina followed him out of curiosity. "Hey, come back!" her father yelled. Chuck ignored him and kept jogging. Dina hesitated, looked back at her father, then followed Chuck. At the head of the tangle of cars, a red Plymouth sat crumpled against a concrete divider, smoke pouring from its engine. While Dina and Chuck watched, flames began to lick up from the bottom of the car toward the doors. "Look out!" someone shouted. "It's on fire!" The crowd began to move back. Dina watched with horror as the fire began to grow. She edged back even farther on the shoulder to get as far away from the car as possible. All at once she noticed that Chuck wasn't with her. He was standing in front of the crowd, staring at the flames as if he was hypnotized. Suddenly there was a broken-hearted scream from the crowd. "Tuffy's in there!" Dina turned to look and saw a young boy holding a bloody towel to his forehead. "Tuffy!" the boy called. "Save Tuffy!" "There's a dog in the car!" someone else shouted, and then Dina could see the face of the small black and white dog at the back window. The dog was jumping up and down, barking hysterically. The flames licked higher and higher. Suddenly someone broke loose from the crowd and began running toward the burning Plymouth. "No!" shouted a man in the crowd. "It's going to blow up!" The figure kept running and then disappeared into the thick smoke. To her horror, Dina realized it was Chuck. "Chuck! Chuck! Come back!" she shrieked, but it was too late. The car exploded in a blazing fireball of red and orange flames. Chapter 3. Even though it was after midnight by the time they got home, and even though school started the next day, Dina couldn't sleep. She just lay in her bed thinking about everything that had happened that night. While everyone in the crowd watched in silent horror, Chuck had come running out of the smoke and flames. Mr. Martinson came up just in time. "What's going on?" he demanded. No one answered. They were all staring at Chuck, his face and hands blackened by the explosion, his shirt ripped. He trotted back to the side of the road, carrying the black and white dog in his arms. "Tuffy! Tuffy!" screamed the little boy. "Chuck, what in the world?" cried Mr. Martinson. Chuck ignored everyone for the moment. He was petting the little animal, talking to it soothingly, his blackened face very close to the face of the dog. After a moment, he straightened up, then handed the small animal to its owner. "Here, kid," he said. The boy's mother, who had a big bruise forming on the side of her face, impulsively hugged Chuck. "Oh, thank you," she said. "You don't know how much that dog means to Timmy. You're a hero. You know that?" "Hey, it's okay," Chuck said, looking embarrassed. "I used to have a dog myself." Dina gazed at her half-brother with a new respect. He was standing there with a goofy grin on his face, and he wasn't even hurt, though he had leapt into a burning car. Later, lying in bed, thinking about it, Dina remembered what the woman had said. To everyone at that accident scene, Chuck had been a hero. He must really be brave, she thought. Or crazy. The next morning at breakfast, Dina decided to let Chuck know she was proud of him and try to make him feel welcome. Her father had already left for work, and her mom was running late as usual. There wasn't time for anything fancy, so she poured 2 bowls of bran cereal. Then she washed a bunch of blueberries and sprinkled them on top. She had almost finished eating hers when Chuck came in, yawning sleepily. "Hi, Chuck," she said brightly. "I've fixed you some cereal. If we hurry, we can get to school early, and then if you want, I can introduce you around." For a moment, Chuck just stared at her. "Forget it, kid," he said. "I don't need any help getting along." "But I only meant—" Dina stopped. Her cheeks were burning as if he had slapped her. He poured some milk on his cereal, not caring if it slopped out onto the table. A moment or two later, Dina's mom came into the kitchen adjusting an earring. "Hurry up, kids," she said. "I'll drop you at school on the way to the office." Without a word, Chuck stood up and dumped his cereal into the sink. Dina just stared at him. What was the matter with him, she wondered. Was he really crazy? By the time she got to the lunchroom at noon, Dina had nearly forgotten her troubles with Chuck. It was good to be back, she thought. Right after she had filled her tray and found a seat, Rob Morrell came sauntering in with a bunch of guys from the track team, trying to look cool the way he always did. In the past, Dina thought Rob was as cool as he thought he was. After all, he was good-looking, smart, and a star athlete. The kind of boy she could never think anything to say to. But that day, she felt different. She smiled, remembering her phone call Saturday night and how she had had Rob eating out of her hand. It gave her a feeling of power, a feeling she could do anything she wanted. She stared at Rob and smiled, not caring if he saw or not. You might think you're the hottest guy at Shadyside, she thought. But little do you know, I'm the girl of your dreams. Yes, me. Shy, quiet little Dina. Yoo-hoo! Anybody home? Dina looked up, startled out of her daydream of power over Rob. Jade was standing behind her, holding her lunch tray. She was wearing a yellow and white striped sundress, and her long hair was tied back with a white ribbon. She looked fabulous. In fact, all the boys in the lunchroom were staring at her. Well, do you want me to join you, or are you going to spend the rest of the afternoon in the clouds? Sure, Jade, have a seat, Dina said. Jade set her tray down, then sat next to her friend. I thought you would be eating with your new brother, she said. Dina shrugged. He's made it pretty clear he's not interested in socializing with his little sister, she said. She tried to sound as if she didn't care one way or the other. Oh, said Jade, looking disappointed. Then she brightened and began looking around the crowded lunchroom. Well, what does he look like, at least? Where is he? He's... Dina swiveled her head around the lunchroom, but saw no sign of Chuck. Well, I don't know where he is, she said. She frowned, suddenly nervous. Why wasn't Chuck at lunch, she wondered. I'll meet him some other time, said Jade. Then she leaned forward. Guess who's just become the hot couple of the month, she said. Who? Said Dina. Bruce Kipnis and Sherry Murdoch. Really? Dina said. Bruce and Sherry were the two fattest kids in the school. They're both in my geography class? And they walked in holding hands this morning, said Jade. Well, I guess that's nice, said Dina. Yeah, I guess no one else would want to go out with either one of them, said Jade. Oh, and I've got to tell you what Mrs. Overton was wearing. You know, she cut her hair really short, almost as short as a boy's. What? Said Dina. I said Mrs. Overton. What's the matter with you? Jade sounded exasperated. I don't know, Dina said. I guess I'm a little worried about Chuck. Somehow I've got a feeling he... Before she could finish her thought, her words were cut off by a sudden banging as the cafeteria doors flew open. Dina turned to look, but all she could see were two bodies crashing into a stack of used trays by the door. Fight! Someone shouted, as the room echoed with the noise of chairs being scraped back, dishes and silverware clattering onto the tables. By now everyone was standing, and a crowd had started to gather by the doors. Dina was on her tiptoes, struggling to see who it was. It's Bobby McCory, Jade called over the excited shouts of the other kids. He's fighting with some new kid. Uh-oh, Dina thought. She climbed up on a chair to see. Oh, no, she groaned. It's Chuck. Look out, the girl beside her cried. The new kid's got a knife. Chapter 4. Okay. So he was having a little trouble keeping it together. The plan was still working right on schedule. Still, no one suspected a thing. Only one more week now. One more week, and he could put the final step of his plan into effect. One more week and all his troubles would be over. Nothing could stop him now. Nothing and nobody. It would just be too bad for anyone who tried. Chapter 5. The second week in September. This school year was going to be a disaster. Dina was sure of it. It was Saturday afternoon, the kind of late summer day when you knew fall would be coming soon. She was standing in the circular driveway in front of her house wearing an old bathing suit under cut-off shorts, washing her mother's silver-colored Civic. Her mind wasn't on the Honda. It was on all the awful things that had happened the past week. First, there were her classes. All of them were harder than she'd expected. Why had she decided to take trigonometry? She'd never pass it in a million years. Second, was her social life. It was going to be a replay of last year, when the only reason she ever got asked out to parties was because she was Jade's friend. She felt even more tongue-tied this year than last, if that was at all possible. And last but definitely not least was the biggest problem of all, her brother Chuck. She still had trouble believing that he'd been stupid enough to get into a fight the first day of school. Even worse, he'd been carrying a knife. It took 3 teachers to break it up. What a temper Chuck had. The only reason he hadn't been kicked out was that her father had gone to the principal and practically guaranteed there would be no more trouble. Dina had overheard her father yelling at Chuck the night after it happened. "And another thing," Mr. Martinson had shouted in a voice Dina had only heard once or twice before. "If you make so much as one misstep, even being caught without a hall pass, you'll be kicked out on your ear. Do you understand?" Dina couldn't hear Chuck's answer, but she could imagine the look on his face, the scowl. That was practically the only expression she'd seen on his face all week. He was grounded indefinitely. But instead of trying to make the best of things and hanging out with the family, he disappeared into his room in the basement right after school and stayed there the whole evening, emerging only to eat a silent dinner. It was almost as if he wasn't there. Dina wouldn't have minded, except the whole atmosphere of the house had changed. Everyone was on edge. Dina's father, who was usually the most easygoing man in the world, had become short-tempered, snapping at Dina and her mother over nothing. And Dina's mom, who was always tense anyway because of her job as chief administrator at the Shadyside Social Services Agency, had become even more jumpy than usual. Dina sighed. Who said your teen years were the best of your life, she wondered. She watched as the soapy water slid down the gleaming sides of the Honda Civic. She turned on the hose and began to spray the car down. "Hey, Dina!" She looked up to see Jade walking up the long flagstone path to the driveway. "Hi, Jade," said Dina. "What's doing?" Jade shrugged. She was wearing a tight, sleeveless white knit shirt and green shorts, and her hair shimmered like liquid copper in the late afternoon sunlight. "I was supposed to go out with Mike Kaminsky tonight," she said, "but he just called to cancel. He has a bad cold, or so he says. So I thought I'd come over and see what you were up to." "You knew I didn't have a date, you mean," said Dina. "Hey, don't get all uptight," said Jade. "I just thought I'd drop by is all." Dina turned off the hose and stood looking at the car critically. "Hey, it's okay," she said. "My mom and dad went into the city for a concert. They left me money to order a pizza and rent a couple of movies. You're welcome to join me." "Sounds like fun," said Jade. Then she smiled her mischievous smile. "What about Chuck?" she asked. "Forget about him," said Dina. "He's Mr. Antisocial. He only comes out of his room to eat." "I'll bet I could change that," said Jade. "I said forget it." Okay, said Jade. "He sure is good looking. What a waste." "I don't believe I washed the car," Dina said, staring out the window. It had been pouring rain for the last hour. "My mother said it never fails," said Jade. "Washing the car can make it rain even if there aren't any clouds in the sky." "Want more pizza?" Dina asked after a moment. She pushed the big square box across the coffee table to her friend. "I'm stuffed," said Jade. "Maybe we ought to see if Chuck wants some." "Will you forget about him?" said Dina. "He's probably in his room plotting to overthrow the whole high school. Come on, let's watch another tape." "I have a better idea," said Jade. "I think it's time for Rob Morrell to get another call from his secret admirer." "Oh, Jade, I don't know," said Dina. For some reason her heart had started beating fast, as if she had just run a race. "Come on, Dina," pleaded Jade. "Let your secret side out." "Well, I suppose it's just harmless fun," said Dina. "Exactly," said Jade. "Harmless and fun." She already had the phone book open and was punching in the numbers into Dina's phone. She held the phone up to her ear a moment and then thrust it into Dina's hand. "Here," she said, sounding excited. It was just like last week, only better. Dina wasn't the least bit nervous once she started talking. If anyone was nervous, it was Rob. He was tripping over his tongue. "Well, couldn't we go out for a cup of coffee?" he asked after a few minutes of chatting. "I think you mean cup of coffee, Rob," Dina said in her sexy whisper. "And I'd like that a lot. But first, I have to be sure." "Sure of what?" "Of you and of things." She was trying to think of more to say when there was a sudden hollow click on the line. "Hello?" said Rob. "Hello, are you still there?" He sounded afraid that she'd hung up. "There must be trouble on the line," said Dina. "I'm very sorry, Rob, but I have to go now. I'll call again one evening soon." She hung up feeling giddy with power. "That was great," said Jade. "But what was that noise?" "I don't know," said Dina. "Maybe there's something wrong with the phone." "I hope not," Jade said. "Hand it over. It's my turn." "Who are you going to call?" "I thought I'd try to call Mike Kaminsky," she said. "Find out if he really had a cold tonight." She began punching in numbers, but before she could finish, there were 3 hard knocks on the door, and it swung open. There stood Chuck, wearing cutoffs and a turquoise-colored REM t-shirt, grinning in that goofy way he had. "Hello, girls," he said. "Chuck, didn't you ever hear of privacy?" said Dina. "Hey, we're family, right?" countered Chuck. Then, turning to Jade, he added, "What's your name?" Dina glanced at Jade. She was looking at Chuck as if he were the lead singer in the world's hottest new rock band. Dina sighed. "Chuck," she said, "I'm Jade Smith," cut in Jade, smiling her whitest, most honey-dripping smile. "And I'm Chuck," said Chuck, smiling right back. "And I'm going to throw up," thought Dina. Chuck sat on the antique bench Dina had kept in front of her dressing table. With his powerful muscles and big frame, he made it look like a piece of doll furniture. "What are you doing here?" said Dina. "Hanging out," said Chuck. "But I don't need to ask what you girls are doing here, or should I say what you're up to?" "What do you mean?" said Dina. "This is your secret admirer, Rob," he said in an imitation of Dina's sexy whisper. "I'd just love to get together with you sometime." "You've been spying on us," said Dina. She felt herself blush to the roots of her hair. "That explains the clicking noise," said Jade. "I wasn't spying," said Chuck. "I just happened to pick up the phone. I'm sure Dad would be interested in what you're up to." "Chuck knows," said Dina. "You wouldn't tell. Dad would take my phone away." "So what?" said Chuck. "You don't need it if all you know how to do is make silly calls to a bunch of stupid high school boys. I mean, if you want to play around on the phone, at least have some imagination." "And I suppose you have a better idea." "I might," said Chuck. "Stop arguing, you two," said Jade, not looking at all perturbed. She gave Chuck a mischievous smile. "Why don't you show us what you had in mind?" "Wait a minute," said Dina. "Why don't we just forget the whole thing?" "I don't think—" "Come on, Dina," said Jade. "It's only harmless fun. You said so yourself. What's wrong with letting Chuck in on it, too?" "Oh, no," thought Dina. Chuck's ideas were bound to be trouble. But what could she do? If Chuck told on her, that would be the end of her telephone, if not her entire social life. After all, Chuck was acting sort of friendly right then. Maybe he was just lonely. Okay, said Chuck. But no more of this dinky, "Oh, Rob, you're so handsome" stuff. Let's make some real calls. Like what? Said Jade. Let me see the phone book, said Chuck. He thumbed through the Shady Side directory for a moment. What a hick town, he mumbled. What do you people do around here for fun? He asked after a minute. A million things, said Dina, feeling furious. The same things you do in the city, probably. Go to the movies, go dancing, miniature golf, bowling. Bowling? That's good, said Chuck. He flipped through the yellow pages. Here we go. Shady Side Lanes. He punched in a number. After a moment, a woman's voice sounded over the speakerphone. Good evening, Shady Side Lanes. I'm only going to tell you this once, said Chuck. He had dropped his voice really low and was speaking in a kind of gravelly tone. There's a bomb planted somewhere on the premises. It's time to go off at 10. Who is this? Demanded the woman. She sounded scared. You have 15 minutes to evacuate, said Chuck, and he hung up the phone. Chuck, said Dina, shocked and appalled. How could you do that? Calling in a bomb threat is serious. Hey, it's probably the only exciting thing that's happened here in months, said Chuck. He laughed and began flipping through the phone book again. It's sort of a funny idea, said Jade. I mean, all those people standing out in the rain in their bowling shoes. Jade, said Dina, for heaven's sake, it's a crime to make bomb threats. You're right, said Jade. Chuck, she said. Her voice sounded all honey again. We were just calling kids from the school. I mean, we don't want to get in trouble. Yeah, said Chuck. Then he snapped his fingers. Wait a minute. I've got an idea. What's the name of that place that's supposed to be so spooky? You mean Fear Street? Said Dina. Yeah, that's it. What a name, Chuck laughed. It's named after some creepy old guy named Stine Fear, Dina told him. You'd better not make fun of it, she added. Terrible things have happened on Fear Street, really. Like what? Chuck said, grinning. People have disappeared, said Jade, and there have been a number of unsolved murders. Late at night, people have heard weird screams from the Fear Street woods. Chuck looked at her with the goofy grin on his face. Get real. Don't you know that every small town has some place like Fear Street? It's all a bunch of garbage just to make a boring place seem more interesting. Fear Street is real, Chuck, said Dina. It's not something to fool around with, Jade added. Dina noticed that Jade was deadly serious now, for once, not flirting. Real or not, said Chuck, I'm not afraid of Fear Street. Let's see now, he said, continuing to flip through the phone book. You want to call kids from the school, right? He said. What's the name of that kid that picked a fight with me the other day? Bobby McCory, said Jade immediately. He and his buddies think they're hot stuff. They're always pushing the little guys around. Well, let's try pushing him around for a change, said Chuck. See how tough he really is. Before Dina could talk him out of it, Chuck had called Bobby's number. May I speak to Bobby McCory? He said in his weird gravelly voice. Dina felt a chill go up her back at the moment Bobby's voice came on. This is Bobby, he said. This is the Phantom of Fear Street, said Chuck. And I've got my eye on you. The Phantom of... Who is this? Said Bobby. I've got my eye on you, Chuck repeated. What do you mean? All of a sudden Bobby didn't sound so confident. Just what I said, said Chuck. I've got my eye on you. The evil eye. If I were you, I'd make sure all the doors and windows are locked tonight, and every night. Say, who is this? Said Bobby, his voice shaky. Dina was about to grab the phone from Chuck when he gave a maniacal cackle and hung up the phone. You're right, Jade, said Chuck. It's much more fun to call up kids from the school. I don't believe you did that, cried Dina. "Bobby McCory is a really bad guy. What if he recognized your voice?" "Don't sweat it," said Chuck. "It's just harmless fun. Or maybe you're afraid of the Phantom of Fear Street," he laughed, then ran to the window and raised it. Outside it was raining harder than ever, and the sky rippled with lightning. "Spirits of Fear Street," Chuck yelled at the top of his voice. "Do you hear me? I'm waiting for you. Right here. Come and get me." He's crazy, Dina thought. He gets that wild look on his face and his whole personality changes. It's like he's two people, and the side of him that loves danger can take over in an instant. Suddenly there was a terrific flash of lightning, and at the same time a rolling clap of thunder. In the next instant the lights went out, and the total darkness was pierced by a blood-curdling scream. After a moment the lights flickered on, and the two girls gaped at each other with wide eyes. "That lightning was really close," said Dina in a shaky voice. "It might have even struck." "Dina!" cried Jade urgently. "Where's Chuck?" Dina took in the room, but Chuck was nowhere. Then there was a groan over by the window. "Over here," said Jade. "Quick!" The girls ran over to the still open window. Rain slanted in, and another flash of lightning illuminated Chuck, his limp body curled up on the floor. Chapter 6. For a moment Dina just stared at the still form of her brother. "Chuck!" she screamed. "Chuck!" "Oh no!" cried Jade, her voice trembling. She bent over him. "What do you think? Is he... Ah!" Jade and Dina both jumped back at the same moment as Chuck sat up screaming, "Booga booga!" Then he lay down on the floor again, laughing so hard he started to choke. "I sure had you going there," he gasped between laughs and coughs. "Guess the so-called spirit of Fear Street had you girls scared half to death." Dina had never felt so many intense emotions so quickly in her life. First had been fright, terrible fright, then shock, and then relief when she realized Chuck was all right. But what she felt now, the strongest of all, was anger. Anger that filled her body until she thought she would explode. "Chuck, you stupid creep," she shouted. "That was really the pits. You shouldn't go messing around with things you don't understand." I'm sorry," Chuck said, breathless from laughter. But he didn't sound sorry. "But hey, I just couldn't resist." All the excitement of the last hour gone, Jade pressed close to the window to glance out. "The rain's letting up," she said. "I guess I'll go home now." "If you don't mind, I'll walk you," said Chuck. "After all, there are strange things out there in the night." And he started laughing again, turning his goofy grin on Jade. Dina was still furious, but Jade didn't seem to mind at all. In fact, she was looking at Chuck as if she didn't care if he was the Phantom of Fear Street. The next day, Chuck apologized and offered to help Dina with her math homework. It was as if he were two people, she thought. One Chuck, the one with the grin, was kind and brave and funny. The other Chuck was mean and immature. Dina was beginning to care a lot for the first Chuck. She just had to think of a way to encourage that side of him. She was still thinking about the two Chucks the next day at school, and nearly bumped into Rob Morrell in the hall on her way to French class. "Excuse me," she said. "My fault," said Rob. "How you doing, Dina?" He gave her a big, friendly smile. Her heart began to pound as she stammered an answer. She remembered the past week when she had felt so powerful after her first anonymous call to Rob. But after what happened the past Saturday night, she didn't feel powerful anymore. Instead, she felt a little dirty and ashamed. She wasn't sure what had changed, except that the calls Chuck had made were mean. They could even be dangerous. The calling game wasn't fun anymore, and she wasn't going to do it again. She'd talked to Jade and Chuck and convinced them to stop. She had her chance in the lunchroom later that morning. She was just about to bite into her mystery meat sandwich when Jade plopped her tray down across the table. "Dina, did you see this morning's paper?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "No," Dina admitted. Listen, Jade, I've got to talk to you. Sure, said Jade, but first, take a look at this. She thrust the Shadyside Morning Press at Dina, nearly knocking over Dina's milk carton. It was open to the front page, and an article was circled in red. As Dina began to read, she felt her heart sink. Bomb threat a hoax, police say. Shadyside police were called to investigate a bomb threat at Shadyside Lanes at 9:45 p.m. Saturday night. Although the entire building was evacuated, officers found no trace of explosives. Louise Cameron, night manager for Shadyside Lanes, reported the phoned threat was made by a male with a hoarse voice. He sounded like he meant business, she said. Corey Brooks, a student at Shadyside High School, was among the more than 30 patrons who waited outside in the rain while the building was searched. Nobody panicked, he said, but I wish they'd have let me finish my game. I was bowling the best game of my life. Although they admit they have no leads, police spokesman Lieutenant Evan Frazier said the investigation is continuing. It may have been just a crank call, he told the press, but we can't rule out terrorism. We're taking this threat very seriously. When she finished reading the article, Dina felt sick and ashamed. She glanced over at Jade, expecting to see shame on her face. Instead, Jade's eyes were shining and her face was flushed. She looked excited. "Can you believe it?" she said. "We actually made the front page of the paper!" For a moment, Dina just stared at her friend in disbelief. "Are you crazy?" she said. "This is serious. It says here that the police are investigating." "Oh, they'll never find us," said Jade. "What is this us stuff, anyway?" Dina went on. "It was Chuck who phoned in the bomb threat." "Lighten up," said Jade. "Nobody was hurt." "No," Dina agreed, "but they could have been. What if someone had panicked at the bowling alley? And what about that other call? The one Chuck made pretending to be the Phantom of Fear Street?" For a moment, Jade's face changed, and Dina could see a flicker of fear in her eyes. "What about it?" Jade said finally. "That wasn't so harmless," Dina went on. "That call was really scary. He really wanted to frighten Bobby McCory." Jade was frowning now. "All right, so maybe Chuck shouldn't mess around with Fear Street when he makes calls. But I like telephoning, and you do too. Admit it, Dina." "Well, maybe the calls we made to kids at school were fun," said Dina, "but Chuck's already in enough trouble, and I don't trust him. Besides, making those calls is basically wrong. We've got to stop." "Oh, really?" snapped Jade. "Since when are you the majority? It seems to me that there are 3 of us involved. Maybe Chuck and I ought to have a say." "It's my phone," said Dina. "Well then," said Jade, "maybe I ought to tell Rob Morrell who's been calling him on her phone." She stopped and smiled nastily at Dina's sudden look of horror. "Or," Jade went on, "we can wait for Saturday night, and the 3 of us can discuss it together." By Saturday, Dina was more convinced than ever that she had made the right decision. Making those phone calls was wrong, and she was going to put a stop to them no matter what. Besides, she didn't think that Chuck would really tell her father what they'd been up to. After all, he was involved too. Jade couldn't possibly tell Rob Morrell. Could she? She'd just gotten a little carried away by the excitement. That was all. On the bright side, Dina was getting along with Chuck much better. He had helped her twice during the week with her trig homework and even loaded the dishwasher one night. Maybe Jade was right. He was just lonely. Maybe he was finally adjusting to life in Shadyside. That night, Dina's parents went to visit friends, as they usually did on Saturdays. Dina had decided that a barbecue might be the best thing to put Chuck and Jade in a mellow mood for their discussion. It was a perfect night for a cookout. She made hamburger patties with pieces of cheese inside and her special potato salad with onion, tomatoes, and sliced black olives. While Chuck got the fire going, Dina finished setting the redwood table outside. There was a knock on the gate, and Jade came in carrying a big tub of ice cream. "Smells delish," Jade said. She was wearing one of her jumpsuits, this one made of faded denim and covered with fake patches in bright colors. Dina saw Chuck look at her appreciatively before he turned back to the barbecue. The hamburgers were perfect. charred outside and juicy on the inside, and both Jade and Chuck had had seconds and thirds of the potato salad. After the meal, Chuck seemed to relax for the first time since he had come to Shadyside. Maybe everything was going to be all right after all, Dina thought. The three teens were sitting on the patio in lounge chairs eating peach ice cream and listening to Dina's portable tape player. The sky had darkened to the deep purple that comes before true night, and Dina had her head tilted back watching the stars appear one by one. "Great dinner, Dina," said Chuck, and she smiled. He had actually called her by her name instead of Kid. "I love that salad," said Jade. "The whole thing was fabulous." "Okay," Dina told herself. "There will never be a better moment." "Listen, guys," she said. "We have to have a serious talk. I don't think we should make any more of those phone calls." "Okay," said Chuck. "Fine," said Jade. "In fact," Dina went on, "I think we—" She stopped. "What did you say?" she asked. "We agree," said Jade. "Chuck and I already talked it over." "Yeah," Chuck said. "Jade convinced me it's dumb to take a chance like that, especially since our old man works for the phone company." Dina turned to stare at her brother and her friend. Jade had convinced him? When had they talked? It looked as if Jade was going to be a good influence on Chuck whether he liked it or not. "What else did you want to talk about?" asked Jade. "Nothing, I guess," said Dina. She had never expected to win so easily. It was almost completely dark now, but she saw Chuck's hand slide across the space between his chair and Jade's to clasp Jade's hand. Dina felt a flash of jealousy for a moment and thought of Rob Morrell, but mostly she was just glad for Jade and Chuck. It looked as if they could be good for each other. Dina was thinking that it was so peaceful and nice out there that she could stay forever, eating ice cream and hanging out. The last strains of Dire Straits died down, and she got up to change the tape. She was just pushing the eject button when a dark, fluttering shape brushed her face. She screamed and jumped back. "What's wrong?" called Chuck. "A bat!" Jade shrieked. She jumped up and followed Dina inside. "Hey, girls," said Chuck. "Relax, it's not carrying a switchblade or anything." "Very funny," called Dina from inside. "Bats give me the creeps." "Me too," said Jade. "Chuck, come on in." "Sure," he said. He slid the door open and stood for a moment in the opening. "Close it!" shrieked Jade and Dina. "Close it! You'll let the bat in!" "Here, bat, bat, bat," Chuck said. But he slid the door shut and flopped into the leather armchair by the fireplace. "What is it with you two?" he said. "Are small-town girls afraid of everything?" "Most people with any sense are afraid of bats," said Dina. "They can carry rabies." "That's not why you're afraid of them," said Chuck. "It's superstition. Like that nonsense about Fear Street." "Fear Street isn't nonsense," said Jade. She sat down on the armchair next to Chuck. Dina thought she looked beautiful in the dim light, and also afraid. "Don't you see," said Chuck. "All that stuff you heard happened on Fear Street. It's all exaggerated or made up. It's like the boogeyman. People tell those stories to scare each other. For your information," said Dina, "there aren't any birds in the Fear Street woods. Scientists from all over the country haven't been able to find out why." Chuck laughed. "No birds?" he said. "Now that's what I call a terrifying problem." "People have disappeared," said Jade. "Houses have mysteriously burned down." "Ha!" said Chuck. "Houses. You mean people actually live on Fear Street?" "Well, yes," said Dina. "Who then?" said Chuck. "Monsters, ogres, witches, Dracula." "I don't know," said Dina. The conversation was making her more and more nervous. "I don't know anyone who lives there." "That's just the point," said Chuck. "Now I'm going to prove it to you that there's nothing about Fear Street to be scared of. I'll show you that only ordinary people live there." He switched on the overhead light and reached for the phone book. "Chuck, what are you doing?" cried Dina. "You promised." "I promised not to make any more prank phone calls," said Chuck. "This is different. I'm about to change your lives forever. After this, You'll never be afraid again." His finger stopped at a number in the book, and he reached for the phone. "Who are you calling?" asked Jade. Her face was glowing with excitement the way it had the weekend before. "I don't know," said Chuck. "It's just the first name I found listed on Fear Street." He switched on the loudspeaker and punched in the number. The burring sound of the phone on Fear Street filled the room. "I'm going to prove to both of you that there's nothing to be afraid of." The phone kept ringing. Dina counted 15 before Chuck said, "No one home, I guess. I'll have to find another." On the 16th ring, there was a click, followed immediately by a breathless gasp. Then the shrillest, most frightening-sounding voice Dina had ever heard cried out, "Please! Please come quickly! He's going to kill me!" Chapter 7. "Who is this?" demanded Chuck. "Please," the woman begged. "Whoever you are, you're my only hope. Any minute now he'll—" But her voice was cut off by a man's bellow of rage. While the three teens listened horrified, the speakerphone amplified terror-stricken screams and then the sound of shattering glass. "Hello? Hello?" Chuck said into the phone, and then the woman was back. "Please come," she begged again. "Please help me. You're my only—" There was the sound of a slap, and then a new, gruff voice came over the line. "Who is this?" the voice growled. "What's going on there?" countered Chuck. "It's none of your business," growled the man. "You've got the wrong number, do you understand?" "But I heard—" Chuck began. "The wrong number," the man repeated, and then hung up the phone. Dina, Chuck, and Jade just looked at one another. Finally, Jade broke the silence, her voice soft and scared-sounding. That was another trick call, Chuck, right?" she said. Dina had been thinking or hoping the same thing, but when she saw Chuck's pale face, she knew it hadn't been a joke. "It was real," he said. "Unless someone's playing a trick on me." He looked grim and angry. "Oh, no," said Dina, her legs suddenly weak. "What are we going to do?" "We've got to call the police," said Jade, reaching for the phone. "Wait," said Chuck, grabbing her wrist. "How are we going to explain how I happened to make the call? And why should they believe us? They'll think we're just kids playing phone pranks." "Like that bomb threat," whispered Jade. "Exactly." "We ought to tell someone," said Dina. "That woman sounded like she was in terrible trouble. She said he was going to kill her." "Maybe they were just playing a party game," said Jade, but she didn't sound as if she believed it. "That was no game," said Dina. She stood up. "If neither of you will do it, then I'm going to call." Chuck snatched the phone off the table. "Will you cool it?" he said. He reached for the phone book. "The police emergency number is 911, Dina told him. "I'm not calling the police," said Chuck. "I'm getting the address." He shut the book with a snap and stood up. "You mean you're going over there?" cried Dina, horrified. "I've got to," said Chuck. "I've got to find out what's going on." "Let the authorities find out," said Dina. "What if there's really a maniac loose?" "Then I'll have to stop him," Chuck said. "You heard her. I'm her only hope." "I'm going too," said Jade. She began to pull on her flannel jacket. "You can't go over there alone, Chuck." Dina took a deep breath. "I think you're both crazy," she said. "Maybe I am too. I'll drive. Chuck doesn't know his way around Shadyside yet." She got her mother's extra car keys from the hook at the bottom of the kitchen bulletin board and then followed the others outside. It was a clear, chilly night with a large crescent moon. Dina slid in behind the wheel, Chuck in the bucket seat next to her, Jade in the back. "What's the address?" Dina asked, taking the car around the long circular driveway. 884 Fear Street, said Chuck. "The people's name is Farberson." 884? said Jade. "That must be out near the cemetery." Dina shivered. She had never been to Fear Street at night, and like most people who lived in Shadyside, tried to avoid it during the day. She turned on Division Street, which divided Shadyside into north and south halves, then south on Mill Road, knowing Fear Street would be coming up soon. Although street lamps illuminated the road and the woods to the side, Dina kept seeing things move in the shadows. Chuck and Jade must have felt the same way because nobody said a word until she turned onto Fear Street. At first glance it could have been any other street with its old houses and empty yards. But on closer inspection there was something different about Fear Street. For one thing, there were the ruins of old Simon Fear's mansion, which had burned down long ago, but was still rumored to be haunted. For another thing, the shadows on Fear Street were thicker and darker than anywhere else in town, and most of all, there was a feeling of death and lifelessness. The lawns were more brown than green, and the scraggly trees had only a few moth-eaten leaves on them. Though lights burned in a few of the windows of the houses on both sides of Fear Street, there was no feeling of warmth, of happy family life behind the curtains. "What was the address again?" Dina said. She hoped her voice didn't sound as scared as she felt. 884, said Chuck. 350, 422, read Jade from the signs on the mailboxes. Keep going. Dina guided the Civic deeper and deeper down Fear Street. She usually loved to drive her mom's little car, but that night she wished it was something bigger and more powerful, like maybe a tank. Looming dead ahead in the darkness was the black shape of Fear Street woods. There were only a few houses left now, and Dina began to hope that Chuck had been wrong about the address, that it wasn't 884 Fear Street, or even Fear Street at all, but Hawthorne or Mill Road or Canyon Drive or... "Out there, that's it," said Chuck. Just ahead of them was one more house, set apart from the neighboring houses, a 2-story Victorian with battered shingles and a patchy lawn. Beyond it was nothing but the cemetery. Dina's headlights picked out 884 on a rusted mailbox. She parked in front of the house and cut the lights. The 3 teens looked at the house for a moment. It was in total darkness. It looked as if it had been completely deserted for years. "There's no one home, Chuck," said Dina. "You must have copied the wrong address." "Maybe," said Chuck uncertainly. "But I've got to go check." "I think Dina's right, Chuck," said Jade, sounding very nervous. "This must be the wrong place." "I'm just going to look around," said Chuck. "You girls wait here." He opened the car door and started to get out. Dina remembered how fearlessly he ran to the burning car to rescue the dog. She knew he wasn't about to be talked out of his plan. "There's a flashlight in the glove compartment," she said. "Thanks," he replied. He took out the flashlight. Then, in the light from the ceiling bulb, he flashed his goofy grin for a moment. He shut the door and began to walk up the crumbling driveway. Dina and Jade sat silent in the darkness. Dina thought briefly of locking all the car doors, but then decided Chuck might have to get back in a hurry. Across the street she could just make out the dark looming shapes of trees in the Fear Street woods. On the far side of the house was the outline of the stone wall around the cemetery. From behind it there was a faint, eerie glow from the moon. "I don't know about you, but I'm not staying here another second," Jade said suddenly. "I'm going with Chuck." "Wait for me," said Dina. The 2 girls scrambled out of the car and up the driveway after Chuck. As Dina felt the gravel crunch underfoot, she imagined it was broken bones and felt a shiver go through her spine. They found Chuck standing on the porch, his ear to the door. "I rang the bell," he said. "I can't hear anything." He knocked, tentatively at first, then louder. "The curtains are all drawn," he said. "Let's go see if there's anything around back." The girls followed him off the porch and around the side of the house. Something soft and sticky brushed against Dina's face and she stifled a scream. As she brushed it away, she realized it was only a cobweb. Then she began to wonder what sort of spider had made that huge web. The shutters were closed all along the side of the house, but when they got to the back door, Chuck suddenly raised his hand. "Whoa," he whispered. The glass in the top half of the back door was broken, and the door itself was hanging slightly ajar. With Jade and Dina crowded in behind him, Chuck shone the flashlight through the broken window, revealing an old-fashioned kitchen. In the center of the room lay a table on its side. All around, the floor was littered with broken dishes. Chuck swung the flashlight to the counter, where canisters and jars lay smashed. Their contents of flour, sugar, and spices spilled over the counter onto the floor. Chuck let out a low whistle. "This place has been ransacked," he said. "I'm going in." As he swung the door open the rest of the way, it creaked on its hinges, like the cry from some creature long dead. Dina's heart was pounding so loudly she was sure the others could hear it. Holding her breath, she followed Chuck and Jade into the kitchen. Chuck continued to inch forward, aiming the flashlight just ahead of him, then stopped so suddenly Dina and Jade nearly walked into him. Just beyond the door to the living room, illuminated by his circle of light, lay an outstretched arm. Next to its hand was a telephone receiver. Splattered over both were bright red drops of red blood, running and collecting into dark, spreading pools on the carpet. Chapter 8. For a moment nobody moved. Then Chuck began to walk toward the scene of horror, shining the flashlight ahead of him. "Stay back," he warned the girls. He bent down, then stood up again quickly. "It's a woman," he said in a shaky voice. "I think she's been stabbed." "Stabbed?" shrieked Jade. "Go back to the car," he said. "She must have surprised whoever broke into the place. He might still be here." Dina had never been so scared in her life. Her legs turned to overcooked spaghetti. "Come on," she whispered. "Jade, Chuck, let's get out of here." "You two go on," said Chuck. "I've got to find a phone." "Let's call from somewhere else," said Jade. "There may not be time," said Chuck. "This woman needs an ambulance." He reached over to the wall and flicked on a switch. The sudden brightness was startling, and Dina had to blink several times before she could see. She stepped gingerly into the living room with Jade and suddenly felt faint. The woman was laying on her stomach. Beside her on the floor lay a big, blood-covered carving knife. "Oh no," said Jade, her voice a faint moan. Involuntarily she clutched Dina's hand. Dina glanced around the living room to avoid staring at the woman. The room looked as if a storm had blown through it. Lamps and ashtrays lay broken on the floor. The couch was slit open, its stuffing spilling out. Pictures were pulled from the walls and lay smashed with the other debris. Chuck was bent over one of the few standing tables, dialing the phone. "Hello?" he said. "I want to report a—" Before he could finish, he heard loud footsteps on the stairway to his left. "Someone else is here!" Jade cried. A large, heavy man dressed in a green overcoat and wearing a black ski mask appeared on the stairway. In his right hand he held a tire iron. "What are you doing here?" he growled in a deep, hollow voice. "You stabbed her," said Chuck. "You broke in and stabbed her. You'll never get away with it." "Drop the phone," the man said, chilling menace in his voice. He hurried down the last few stairs, tire iron in front of him, and, as Jade and Dina watched in horror, he began to advance on Chuck. "Chuck!" screamed Dina. "Look out!" Chuck jumped to the side just as the tire iron came swinging down, narrowly missing his head. His eyes darted wildly around the living room, then came to rest where the woman lay. He lunged forward, the masked man after him. Chuck quickly snatched up the carving knife, and he held it out in front of him menacingly. "Back off, mister," he said. The stranger stopped a moment, then nodded slowly. "You won't use that knife," he said. "Better put it down." "Run, girls!" cried Chuck. Quickly, Dina and Jade ran past the masked man and out the front door. Chuck kept the heavy, blood-splattered knife pointed at the intruder. "Put the knife down," the man repeated in his deep voice. "You'll never use it." He reached out one gloved hand as if to take the knife from Chuck. Chuck bounded toward the front door. When he reached it, he heaved the knife at the masked man. It hit the wall over the intruder's head and bounced to the floor. Chuck burst out the door, and then all three of them were running for their lives. "Quick, get in!" shouted Chuck. He shoved the girls into the back seat of the car, then ran around and slid into the driver's seat. "Dina, the keys!" he shouted. Dina frantically began to search through her jacket pockets. In the moonlight they could see the masked man stumbling down the driveway. He was heading straight for them, and then she remembered. "They're in the ignition!" Chuck flipped on the motor and floored the accelerator. With a squeal, the car spun away from the curb. Chuck gunned it to the end of the street, a dead end. "Chuck!" cried Jade. "He's getting in his car! Hurry!" Dina turned and saw the man get into an old model sedan in the driveway of the house. Chuck slammed the Civic into reverse. "Hold on!" he shouted. He gunned the car backward along the way they had come. The stranger pulled out of the driveway and was coming after them. Chuck continued to floor the pedal, flying backward past the dark houses all along Fear Street and out onto Mill Road. Too late. Dina saw the lights of a big truck bearing down on them from the south. "Look out!" she shouted. Chuck wrenched the steering wheel and the Honda fishtailed onto the shoulder. The truck swerved past, just missing them, its horn blaring. The little car was still skidding. "Look out! We're going into a ditch!" Dina screamed. But somehow Chuck managed to get control. Breathing a sigh of relief, he spun the car around and began heading north on Mill Road. "He's still following us!" shrieked Jade. "Faster!" "Which way?" shouted Chuck. "Turn left!" cried Dina. With a protesting squeal, the little car turned onto Canyon Drive. The masked man's headlights were still behind them. "Turn right!" Dina screamed. "Now left!" The little car swerved so hard that Dina thought it might fall apart. They hit a deep hole in the road, and Dina's head hit the roof. Before she could regain her balance, Chuck had swerved again, and then again onto a narrow dirt road. "Have we lost him?" cried Jade, sounding weak. "I think so," Chuck replied, staring hard into the rearview mirror. "Let's go home," Dina said, feeling exhausted. "We'll be safe there." Chuck turned the car up Park Drive and finally into the North Hills section of town where the Martinsons lived. All three teens breathed in deeply when the car finally pulled into the circular driveway and Chuck cut the motor. For a moment they just sat in the car catching their breath. Then they heard the squeal of brakes and the sound of a car roaring up the hill toward the house. Feeling a chill run down her back, Dina looked down the road and saw the headlights approaching fast. "Oh no," cried Chuck. "It's him."